Welcome back to this third video in Aruba Mobility Switch series. My name is Tobias van Inge, and in this video we're going to have a little bit of a look at how to configure SSH and secure web access. And we're going to do this with Clearpass. Clearpass is a product that is where you can configure policy context, but you can also use it as a radius server. And I think it is very important in the mobility infrastructure that you have a really good policy server. And for this time, we're going to use it as in order to authenticate SSH and in order to authenticate secure web access. So let's have a look at the steps we're going to take. First, we're going to look at the show IP SSH. So what is the status? And then, of course, we need to enable SSH. We're going to have a little bit of a look and overview what the radius configuration is of the switch. And we're going to configure the radius server. Then we will configure SSH authentication both for login and for enable mode. And then we're also going to change that back if we push an administrative privilege via the Clearpass server and let the switch adopt it automatically so that we can then more or less disable the enable mode and count on the information that comes from radius. Of course, we're going to enable accounting because every organization wants to know which SSH session has been going on and which commands have been used. We're going to enable the accounting for both SSH, web, and the console session, both for the session and for the commands. And after that, we're going to create a self-signed certificate for SSL because we don't want to do HTTP-based web-based management, but we want to do it via HTTPS. And the last step we're going to do is authentication for secure web and for the console. So let's go to the switch and let's first go to the Clearpass server. As you can see here, let me make it sure it will fit in the screen. And let me show you the profiles I've set up. So there is a network admin profile here. And what you can see is the device group list is the ABCN Aruba switches. And if you look at the devices, there's one device here. Is ABCN X01. This is the IP number. There's a description, shared secret. The vendor name is HP. We put some SNMP resetting in there, and that's it. And in order to make it easier for you in a real life environment, we also created a group. And this time I created a list group, which you can also do a subnet or regular expressions. And I added this switch to the group. Then if we go back to the profile, you can see that this is used against this device group. And I also added an attribute, and that's the administrative privilege I set. So that's the attribute is an IETF. You need to configure the service type, and it's either 6 if it is an administrative user, or you add 7 is it an operator user. Profile, the device group list, and the attributes. Then we have the policy. Policy we have here. It's more or less default is deny. We're using the local repository for authorization, and we have a rule that is, and the action is the network admin profile we just saw. And of course, we had to combine everything in the service, where you can see the authentication methods either PEP or MSCHEP. Local repository is used for authentication source, and we have the Aruba switch enforcement profile configured. If we then look at the local user repository, is identity, and then we go to the local users, and there is a local user here configured, Tobias. I put it in another role, but you can of course configure role if you are in a production environment and want to meet certain role structure that comes from your security officers. Okay, so that's the configuration. So let's go into the monitor mode for access tracker and build up this this config. So what I do now is I will try to make this a little bit smaller so that we can live monitor it later on when we start to do testing. Let's go to the console port of the switch. Press double enter and I'm connected. As you know, in the last video we configured the management password, so I need to log on here with the management password. And let me put the terminal length a little bit longer, well, to 40 probably. Let me do a show run and I can show you the configuration. So the hostname we configured in the recommended minimum settings. We configured the SNTP server, the default gateway, and we also gave it a fixed IP address on VLAN 1. And we did the SNMP read community and the SNMP contact configured in here. So let's first have a look at what the status is of the SSH server. So as you can see, SSH is not enabled but disabled. So what we're now going to do is enable SSH. Therefore, we need to go into the config mode and we type IP SSH. So let's see if that changed something. And indeed it did, because we enabled SSH right now. So let's have a look at what the default status of the show radius is. So there is nothing configured. So there's no radius server configured. And if we look at the default state of the authentication, as you can see, there's only the NAS identifier, and that's the hostname of the switch and nothing else. So let's make sure we configure a radius server, and the radius server we configured is the Clearpass server. We just had a look in how we configured that. So radius server, then radius server host, we give it the IP address is 10.10.10.10. Let me make sure this is correct. And we all know what we're talking about. I have two ports in here. This is the management port, and the data port is the 10.10.10. 10. Then the key we're going to use is ABCN rocks, and then this sign. We do enter. Let me do a show run, and you can, as you can see here, radius server host. You don't see the key configured here. That has to do because we didn't enable the include credential. So I will show you that in a couple of seconds. So this key we provided here, you need to make sure that if you configure that and you go to the configuration section here of devices, you make sure that the radius shared secret needs to be aligned with the radius host IP and then key, and then the key you type in there. So that's where you know where that comes from. Because if I do now include credentials, just to show it to you, show run, you can see that now you can also see my password manager. You didn't start it up front, and you can see the key here. So before I type that command, you couldn't see that the key here, and you couldn't see the password manager. So in order to make that visible, you need to do include credential. Of course, you need to figure out if that's needed in your environment or not. Okay, so now let's have a look at the show authentication. So if I do show radius now, you can see that I have a radius server configured, default authentication and accounting port, encryption key is configured, and if I do a show radius authentication, you can see we also collecting now some stats if everything is ready to go. So let's have a look at the show authentication setting. So what you see here is console, login primary is logo, login secondary is none, SSH and web is the same, and also for enable everything is default. So now what we want to do is we want to start configuring the SSH authentication. So you do that by AAA authentication, SSH, and then you type login, because that's what we're first going to configure, radius. So, and I'm not going to do a secondary because I don't want to have a secondary. Normally what I want in a production environment here is I want to have a series, so I'm going so a group of radius servers so that I have fallback and redundancy, but I don't want to have a secondary method for my secure login. I'm going to do that for my console, but that's something different, but not for SSH. So that's being configured. So let's have a look at show authentication again. As you can see now, SSH radius. The primary group is radius. It's important to note you can create your own group, so there is a default group radius, and the first three radius servers you add will be added to the default group, or you need to change that specifically. But I didn't do that. For me, the default group is fine in this setup. And you can see the enable. I didn't do anything on the enable. So let me first write this and save this, and then let me see if I can open the console here and if we can get something to work. I will make the screen bigger later on. let me restart this screen. Let me log in with Dobias. Type in my password. No, I don't want to save it. And I'm logged in. And as you can see, I will show you later, I'm logged in as operator. And here is the latest timing. So I can open this one and you can see that I'm logged in and input output. You can see the radius request, where the end host identifier comes from. So you can see all the information. But now if I want to do enable, and I want to do Dobias again, and this password, unable to verify password, because I didn't enable yet the SSH enable login via radius. So the only way I can get an enable is by using the manager password that I configured in the recommended minimum, and then I can get to enable. Okay, let me log out, and let's make sure we can also do authentication for enable, because enable here, as you can see, is local none. If we want to do that, we need to configure AAA authentication SSH and then enable radius, and we do none. So if you do show authentication, you can see now radius none. Yeah, and this is the same default group. So if we start to reset that here, let's do restart that. We do Dobias. Type in the password. And now if you do enable, you can do Dobias again. Type in the password, and I'm getting authenticated. So if I now look to the Clearpass server, let me make it a little bit, oh, sorry, this is the wrong one. Let me take this one, make it a little bit bigger. Go to refresh, you can see that there is multiple switch logins against this radius server. Okay. That being said, but for some organizations, this is not really handy to let every user log on twice. So they more like, they say, okay, we configure this. We know which users are my administrative user because I configured that manually and it's very under control. So the way we can change that is by setting a command named what we called respect the privilege levels. As you can see here, that's disabled. And in order to configure that, is we are in this steps here, is what we're going to do is we're going to set first of all the SSH authentication for enable back to default. So SSH and enable, and that's local none. So now if I do show authentication, you can see that's back to local none. But we're also going to configure this IAA authentication. You can see respect privilege is still disabled. We do login, login. Oh, yep, sorry, and then the privilege level. Now if I do show authentication, you can see that I enabled. What this says is that if we go to the Clearpass server and we go to the enforcement profile, you can see that it's going to accept this. So if it is 7, it is an operator. If it is 6, it is an administrator level. So let me go to the access tracker, make this screen a little bit smaller like this. Save this configuration. Let me show it to you first. What we have, AAA authentication privilege mode and login radius. So we remove the enable mode. So now let's get a console back here. Let's restart this, log in as Dobias. No, not going to save it. You will see pop up here a new one coming in. And as you can see, I'm immediately in enable mode and I don't need to log in automatically. And we have a separate session here. If we make this bigger again, then you can see that the output, this type is pushed to the switch and adopted by the switch. So this makes it handy for the administrative users that they don't need to log in twice. Of course, everything depends on the on the policies of your organization. Okay, that being said, but we also want to do some accounting, of course, because we want to make sure that we can find out really well who logged on and what commands are being used, etc. So we do show accounting. So at the moment, there is no accounting configured. Important accounting for SSH is the exec and the commands. System is everything around accounting, around reboots, etc. The network accounting is most of the times used when you do .1x sessions. So this time we're going to focus on exec and system. So let me configure accounting, and we are at this step here. So we're going to do AAA, accounting, exec, and we do start stop, and we do it for radius. Yeah, enter, right, and I want to do this step by step so that you see really well what we change. And let's get a console here. Let's restart the session again. Dobias. Let me type in the password. Say no. See if we have a new session, 16. Okay, and if we also have some accounting here. Not yet, so let's see if I do some. 1 second. We have to do, but I don't do yet command authentication, so probably I will get the authentication when I do the stop session. Is here, there it is, 16. You can see that I have some authentication session now. This is my accounting, so you can see that it's still active. That is an active session. NAS IP, calling station ID. This is the session ID internally, and we have the details here. Yeah. Okay, so if I now do go this one and say logo yes, so I log out. Then if everything is correct, let's go to the access tracker here. That's the end of the session if accounting. As you can see, the session is now inactive and we got some details on there. Yeah, but you don't see that I type commands in here yet. So we don't have command accounting yet enabled. We more just have the session. So we know when somebody log on, where logs on, etc. So in order to also get the account, the commands information, we need to do AAA, accounting, we do commands, and we do, well, let's do the stop only, and sorry, let's do stop only, do the radius one. Okay, let's do write mem. So now, if we restart this session, log on, Dobias, okay, let's go to the Clearpass server, go see if you have a new session. Sorry, let's do this one. Okay, we have a new session here. Yeah, it's accepted. So let's go to my session, make sure we get some accounting information, show run, conft, quit. Now if we go to the accounting information, you can see here we have session, and you can see that I did quit command, I did configure terminal command, I did show running config, and to make sure you all believe me that this is it, so let me do conft again, and you can see that this will be updated with the conft session in here. You see? Okay, let me close this, then close the session. So this way you exactly know who logged in your environment and what are the commands he typed into this environment. This is very good for regularity, compliance, your security in general. Yeah. Okay, so that's the way you configure accounting and have SSH. I think this is really nice because you have secure access to the switches from a terminal session perspective. So let's go back to our configuration tabs here. So this is the command accounting we do. So let's make sure instead of HTTP, we're also going to use HTTPS, so SSL-based web management. But we also want to use the same accounting information, and we also want to make sure that we have authorization or well authentication via Clearpass. So in order to enable HTTPS, we first need to create a self-signed certificate. So if we do show crypto PKI local certificate, then you can see that there is nothing yet. So we need to do that before we can enable it. And of course, if you have a signed certificate by a certificate authority, you can also use that. But I don't have it, so I'm going to do it like this. Certificate named ABC. Let's call it ABC Networking. And then what we are going to do now is we get a valid start date. So today is 26. Oh, sorry, I need to start with the date. I will show you. Month 02 26 2016. Let's give it a valid end date, and let's give it, for example, for 2 years or 4 years, depending on the regulations in your environment. So let's say 2018. And if I want to do it right, if I just now do the default usage web, for example, I don't need to type in any additional information because it will take the default. But let's take subject and do enter because I want to give it some common name. ABC Networking Organization Unit. So let's call it ABCN. Under org, ABC. Locality, let's get Netherlands. So no state. Country is also Netherlands. And that's it. So now we configured a self-signed certificate. If you look at that, you can see that there is usage for web. So let's save this. And let's make sure that, so we have the local certificate now. So the next step we need to do is make sure we enable this web management SSL. So that's also enabled right now. AA, authentication. Authentication for the web logon. Sorry, web login. And it will use the same privilege, and I'm not going to do this. I don't need a server group because I'm going to take the default, but I'm going to do none. So if you now do show authentication, you can see web is now the web UI radius none. And this is not needed because it will accept it from the radius server. So let's go to the login page. And let's get a screen next to it here to see the login. So let me go Dobias and type in the password. Okay. I had an unsuccessful login before, but now it's going fine. And you can see I got a new authentication here by 23, and that's my web login authentication. And I also have accounting information immediately. But what is really cool now is let me go to system, for example, SNMP. And for example, let's go to the status. So let me change the system location here to test. Save that. And then what you will see here, let's go to the accounting information in here. Oh, sorry, it's in that screen. Let's go, sorry, need to go to the accounting. What you can see as an IP server location test is changed, so let me change that again for you and save it. Let's go here, details, you can see that I changed it, it's clear to parameters. So what is really cool, we now even have enabled secure web access via SSL, enabled authentication via the Clearpass server, and also have the logging information, so all the accounting information, so that we know if people what they did on either on the terminal session or on the web session. So let me log out here, clear the screen. So that's really cool. So enabled the web management, and then enabled the authentication. And the next step we're going to do is we also want to make sure we got secure access to the console. So, and in order to do that for the console authentication, you don't want to be logged out on this console. So that's why we do radius and then we do also local as fallback. So as you can see for SSH we have radius and local none, because I don't want to have a fallback for them because I'm going to create a redundant server group. But for console I always want to make sure I can get access to that, and we will have a look how that works. But let's first save this. Let me get to the Clearpass server, and then I need to log out. This is my serial connection, so logo here, yes, and let's do double enter. I'm connected, as you can see. Username Tobias. Sorry, let me put this one on the access tracker, and let me type in the password here and access. So let me make this screen a little bit bigger. You can see there is a new one, and this is my console session, also including accounting, so that we have that automatically configured again. Yeah, and it adapts the administrative privilege automatically. But as said, we also want to make sure that we have a fallback if the radius server is not available, but you still can access the. Let me first do term length 40, then do a show run, and let me create an additional local user here that we can use for fallback. As you can see, we have all this now configured here. So, and I will do a rewrap at the end. So sorry, let me create a user. Password, it will be a manager user because I want to have access. I'm going to give it a username. Let's call it ABC and admin. And I can give it, let's give it a plain text password so that everybody sees what we're doing. ABCN rocks. So let's do a show run. So normally, if I don't have these include credentials, you will not see this user. Yeah? So that's why we have the include credential here. So let's write mem. Okay. Let me do a logo here. Yes. And I'm now going to disconnect the port of the switch that is connected to the Clearpass server. So that has now happened. Let me get connect to the console port again. And I'm going to log in with my normal username as I would do normally. Then you will see that the normal timeout timer will kick in. And that will, I think by default, that's 5 seconds or something. Attempting to authenticate, and then it will figure out that the radius server is not there. And we have no redundancy, so really, really bad happens in the environment, but we still want to make sure we can connect to the switch. Okay, unable to authenticate user. Then it should go, you see username, so we go to do ABC and admin, ABCN rocks, and there we are, log on as manager. And this way you can always get back to the switch on the console port of the switch. So let me do term length 40 and do a recap of all of this. So we configured the Clearpass server, we configured the device, we added device groups to make it easy. Then we created the profile and the policy to make sure that it's attached to that device group, and we push the administrative privilege. And of course, then you have this server that is making sure that the local user is using the local database as authentication source. This PEP and MSCHAP, depending on what you want. And of course, these profiles are attached to that. So then in the switch, I did include credentials to show you what I configured. Depending on the rules of your organization and the regulations, you can either do that also. Then I configured the radius server with the shared secret that is matched to the device in the Clearpass. Then I started to configure first the SSH logon radius, and I also did the enable, but I could remove it because we are adapting the login privilege from the radius server. After that, I configured the accounting for the session, and I configured the accounting for the commands typed in that session so that we have all that information visible. Then I configured the self-signed certificate, and I enabled SSL for wedge management, and I also enabled the authentication for web, and of course the accounting will take with it, including the login privilege mode. So, and as last step, I enabled console authentication, but I also did local fallback for local if something really bad happened, and that's why I created this username admin. So I hope This gives you a good overview how you can configure SSH, secure web access, secure console access with a fallback to local for your environment, for your mobile infrastructure. And if there's any question, you can always let me know. So I hope you really like it, and leave some comments or questions or ideas for new sessions in the comments field, and hope to see you next time.